Mythology is the remarkable attempt to address questions of fundamental importance for mankind. It is the form of study that not only demands to know the world and the self, but also demands some kind of practical justification or guarantee for such knowledge. The ancient Greeks formulated what they called aporetic questions, realizing that the journey of knowledge is long, arduous, and sometimes dangerous. They were the first to concentrate their attention on the art of thinking in the hope that the journey will end well, in spite of oracular proclamations to the effect that it is ruin and destruction that awaits mankind. The ancient Greek philosophers also attempted to answer the so-called aporetic questions they formulated methodically, by developing the tools of dialectic, elenchus, and logic. This exploration, however, was preceded by the obscure and secretive methods used by the oracles to arrive at two of the truths relating to man's essence that were expressed in the hylomorphic account of Aristotle's rational animal capable of discourse. Namely, 1. Everything created by man is destined for ruin and destruction. 2. Know thyself. These truths were proclamatory warnings against the hubris of man who had proceeded by this time to build complex civilizations, governed by the rule of law. These warnings, indeed, may have been Parthian shots by the oracles, whose influence was already beginning to wane in Greece. Socrates and Plato were, we now know, abandoning the temple for the agora, the amphitheatre, and the academy. Plato, we also know, chose to present the thoughts of Socrates in dialogue form, which were then performed in the amphitheatres and also in the Olympic Games. Aristotle's Lyceum was, on the other hand, engaging in early revolutionary biological experiments alongside lectures on the principles of Sush. Plato, then, may well have been the first of the institutional professors, and together with Aristotle, symbolized a concept of the university, which was never pursued, namely, that which was striving in the name of universalism to produce polymaths who loved wisdom. Nevertheless, in the cases of Plato and Aristotle, there is deep respect for religion and the oracles of the temples. Some of Plato's ideas, however, can be construed as the beginning of a process of the marginalization of religious practices and institutions. Socrates, as part of his defense against the charge of heresy, claimed that philosophy was one of the children of the gods, and this at the time might also have been regarded as heretical. We do not know exactly how it was received by the 500-man jury, most of whom probably did not understand what Socrates was attempting to do in the agora, or even why the oracle thought he was the wisest man in Athens. Both Plato and Aristotle believed that the proclamation by the oracle to know thyself was an important one, and the failure to follow this piece of advice might well end in the ruin and destruction of civilization. The ancient Greeks, when confronted by the gigantic Persian army with relative success, proved that they were proud of their own civilization, demonstrating their independence from what they saw to be an autocratic tyrannical form of government. The characterization of justice that Socrates provides us with early on in the Republic is that justice consists in citizens of the Republic working in accordance with a principle of specialization, where they work in occupations in accordance with their abilities and capacities, whilst not interfering with the work of occupations they have no capacity for. This argument for justice in the city, of course, builds upon the Socratic account of justice for the individual, which is that those guilty of unjust conduct get what they deserve. This, in turn, relates to the oracular proclamation that everything created by humans is destined for ruin and destruction, in the sense that it is unjust conduct on a large scale that will lead to the ruin and destruction of the city-state. Campbell refers to this principle of specialization when he points out that the first early civilizations that endured over time were characterized by the professionalization of various important occupations. He names priests, merchants, and farmers, but interestingly fails to mention teachers and warriors. Perhaps it was not yet evident that a civilization needs, according to Aristotle, three different kinds of forms, namely, reproduction of children, reproduction of important artifacts and tools for living, and finally, but perhaps most importantly, the reproduction of important ideas via the process of teaching. All three kinds of forms were necessary, according to Aristotle, if a city-state was to become self-sufficient, and not be dependent on propitious external circumstances for its survival. As the civilization progresses, the need for a greater differentiation of occupations becomes necessary for self-sufficiency. We ought to recall that the evolutionary development of the city-state, for Aristotle, begins with a large extended family, continues with a number of extended families forming a village, and then ends with a number of villages coalescing to form the city-state. Self-sufficiency is a difficult concept to define, but it almost certainly refers to the needs of the citizens, which would be exceedingly difficult to list. The psychology of Maslow may, however, serve as a guide in this matter. Maslow argues that certain needs are more fundamental than others, and some needs arise when the more fundamental needs are met. Given the fact that we are animals, survival and reproduction are obviously important needs, and Maslow includes at the base level of his hierarchy both sexual and physiological needs for food, water and oxygen, etc. If these needs are consistently and systematically met, the next needs to arise are security/safety needs, which, in our more complex societies, can take a manifold of forms, e.g., physical safety from physical harm, health safety which follows from access to medical care, emotional security which follows from not being subjected to unnecessary anxiety, fear and stress, financial and work security which follows from having a job that provides us with money and resources to meet our maintenance needs, legal and social security needs that follow from the prevalence of justice in the society, and the sense of being part of a recognized community. The next level of needs are love and belongingness, which follow from the need for intimate relations and friendships. Self-esteem needs are next in the hierarchy, and this follows from the more abstract need for respect. All these hierarchical levels also require that our cognitive and aesthetic needs are met, and these are also relatively abstract and concerned with knowledge, justice, and freedom. If, Maslow argues, all these needs are consistently and systematically met, we will, as individuals, become self-sufficient and relatively independent of our circumstances. Self-sufficiency for a city-state is relative, because of the obvious difficulties in obtaining justice and freedom for everyone. It would seem as if the fundamental condition for such a state of affairs would be the citizens all being friends, and treating each other as ends in themselves, which is something that, according to Kant, might take 100,000 years to achieve. It is clear now why the wisest of the ancient Greeks, namely Socrates, thought philosophy to be a child of the gods, and a necessary discipline, if one was to be able to answer all the aphoretic questions arising about our human political, religious, artistic, and ethical lives. Mathematics was, of course, taught to some professions who needed such knowledge for the instrumental purposes of the state, such as tax collecting, designing temples, etc. Pythagoras was a teacher of mathematics as a form of episteme, but his life is shrouded in mystery in spite of his fame as a mathematician. The transmission of skills is obviously an important civilization builder, and various instrumental forms of practical knowledge are necessary for such technical matters, techni. These forms of knowledge obviously differ in relation to those forms that are categorical, such as the knowledge of archy, principles, and dike, justice. The logical principles of non-contradiction and sufficient reason are then necessary to justify categorical answers to categorical questions, such as, what is justice? St. Augustine, for example, uses the principle of non-contradiction to point out that an unjust law is no law at all. The importance of knowledge to ancient Greece, then, stands in sharp contrast to the role that knowledge plays in the Garden of Eden myth, whose moral is that we ought not to have eaten the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because this was a divine matter to be left to divine beings. Questions relating to the knowledge of good and evil are clearly aphoretic questions, and Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle took us some way along the path of answering these questions. Kant took us further along the path, but the journey has not ended, and Kant was probably correct in his judgment that the journey to the cosmopolitan kingdom of ends that lies at the end of the path is going to occupy us for a very long time indeed. The complex interplay of the threads of archy, episteme, arete, logos, and aletheia will need to be unraveled to lay bare the nature of such knowledge of the good. Given the obvious importance of knowledge in the process of the actualization of the idea of the good, one implication for the professions occupied with city-state business is that teachers and the institutions of education will play a vitally important role in the fate of the city-state. Institutions such as the Academy and the Lyceum were indeed originally used as blueprints for our universities, but that blueprint appears to have used a principle of specialization in an exceedingly narrow sense, and as a consequence lost the grasp of many universal aphoretic questions such as, what is knowledge? What is the good? What is the beautiful and sublime? And perhaps also the questions, what is justice? And in what sense does God exist? Perusing the educational system of the ancient Greeks, we find that doctors were trained in temples, using an apprenticeship system. This may have been due to the promotion of Aeschylus to the status of a god. Priests, paradoxically, were not trained in the temple, but in specialized religious institutions, and perhaps here too, the principle of specialization was conceived too narrowly. Plato's Academy contained an area of the institution devoted to the worship of the gods, and we also know that the last request of Socrates before he was put to death by drinking from the poisoned chalice was to request that one of his friends sacrifice a cock to Asclepius, presumably in gratitude for the relatively painless effect of the poison he was forced to imbibe. When Socrates was practicing his new method of elenchus in the agora, it was clear to him that his method needed to justify the oracle's claim that he was the wisest man in Athens. His chosen targets were powerful people, politicians, sophists, priests, who were prepared to use the law to retain their power over the community, using it as a means to their ends, that is to say, unethically. This particular use of the law brought Athens into disrepute, and established philosophy as an important subject in the task of educating the citizens of a society. The early philosophers, we ought to recall, were so-called natural philosophers interested in the phenomenal happenings of the physical world, especially what is happening in the heavens. We recall the curious role of Anaxagoras in this respect, who proclaimed that the moon was not a godlike ethereal entity, but rather a solid body similar to that of the earth, reflecting the light of the sun. Anaxagoras claimed also that Noos was the initiator and regulator of all change, a kind of cosmic mind. Apparently Socrates was convinced by Anaxagoras's writings to abandon his investigations into the physical world and concentrate instead upon the cosmic mind or Noos. Socrates eventually transferred his efforts into the field of the life world and focused upon those various powerful experts in the polis who thought they knew what they were doing, but was simply making the worse argument appear the better to those who questioned what was being done. The Socratic method, then, was both philosophical and educational. Plato's theory of forms, we ought to recall, proposed that the form of the good was the most important of all the forms, and Plato sought to justify his claim by using both argumentation and allegory, thus combining both philosophical and mythological thought. Forms are forms of thought which, according to Plato, determine the template for everything we name or talk about, and Plato furthermore characterizes external world entities as imitations or copies of the original forms. Forms, for both Plato and Aristotle, are that which justifies and explains what we encounter and question in the external physical world. For Aristotle, however, the formal cause, explanation, of something is only one kind of explanation among many, and furthermore this is not, as Plato claimed, situated in some kind of non-physical spiritual realm, but rather, for Aristotle, something that is situated in the world. The mythology and religion of Plato's times was one source of the form of the good, and good art for Plato refused to present the gods fighting, arguing, stealing, etc., as we encounter them in Homer's writings. Eros, in relation to the beauty of the human body, the human soul, and the human laws of the city, involved the power of the imagination, the emotions, understanding, and reason, all of which were necessary for leading the examined contemplative life characteristic of eudaimonia. Divine powers, as represented by the demiurge and the Erinyes/Eumenides, formed part of the Greek pantheon of powers, which have a complex relation to what Plato and Aristotle called the formal causes, or what religion regarded as the realm of the sacred. Both of these mythical impersonal powers belong to an older conception of the divine and sacred, which was supplemented by Zeus and his anthropomorphized pantheon of personalities that included many goddesses such as Athena, who concerned herself with principles of wisdom and justice. As the centuries passed, however, the philosophy of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle endured as an intellectual activity concerned with the answering of aporetic questions, usually reserved for the oracles, questions relating to being, the sacred, the true, the beautiful, the sublime, and justice. Mythology, however, was experiencing a decline owing firstly to the ascendancy of Christianity, which historically has proved itself to be one of the more intolerant religions, secondly, due to the decoupling of the forms, the true, good, beautiful, etc., from religious practices and institutions. Scientific knowledge then became more and more dependent upon a mathematical form of thinking, and as a result promoted a general skepticism about anything that could not be observed, measured, or manipulated. The formulating of aporetic questions relating to abstract ideas, such as being and other transcendental and metaphysical matters, were lost in the wave of secularization that began sweeping over Europe. One reaction to this state of affairs was the emergence of spirit seers, who appealed to supernatural experiences that were appearing increasingly delusional with the passing of the centuries. Kant warned us of this emerging phenomenon, yet as late as the 1900s, Carl Jung was still attempting to rehabilitate the supernatural world of spirits in the name of psychology. In relation to this wave of secularization, Campbell claims the following: "The word myth now means falsehood, and so we have lost the symbols and the mysterious world of which they speak. But we need the symbols, and so they come up in disturbed dreams and nightmares that are then dealt with by psychiatrists." It was Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and Jacob Adler who realized that the figures of dreams are really figures of personal mythologization. At present our culture has rejected the world of symbology. It has gone into an economic and political phase where spiritual principles are completely disregarded. Our religious life is ethical, not mystical. The mystery has gone, and society is disintegrating as a result. The Myth of Light. Pages 18 to 19. We see a sign of this decay in the writings of the psychiatrist Jung, where the transcendent and the metaphysical mysteries are transposed into the so-called mystery of an afterlife, populated with ghosts and spirits. For Freud, these are fantasy-laden figures generated by psychological processes that we need his later work to give a full account of. The clinical Freud and his technical language, indeed, help us to understand the defense mechanisms operating in pathological experiences. Sometimes these spiritual experiences relate to trauma, and sometimes to modern man's fundamental discontentment with a life without obvious meaning, which Kant described already during his time as melancholically haphazard. Kant, we know, explored in detail the mysterious aporetic questions relating to God, the soul, and freedom, and he was perhaps the last great philosopher who could write with an open mind about a transcendental ego situated in a noumenal world, which we can merely glimpse from our lives in a phenomenal world of space, time, and causation. Freud claims he is a Kantian psychologist, but does not seem able to capture the Kantian penchant for exploring the transcendent and metaphysical realm of the sacred. When Freud speaks of God and religion, he tends to focus upon popular attitudes towards spiritual figures, which are clearly childish projections of anxieties and wishes. Fear and desire are the major characters of the Freudian religious drama, characters that do not perform any cathartic function. From Freudian times onward, dating perhaps from 1929, it appears as if the mystery of life is no longer the concern of anyone. The aporetic question of being and its many meanings has all but disappeared from our intellectual concerns. Campbell evokes Eastern myth in general, and the Upanishads in particular, which he claims retains a concern for one of the many meanings of being, namely, the mystery of life. "Bring me a fruit of that banyan tree. Here it is, venerable sir. Break it. It is broken, venerable sir. What do you see there? These seeds exceedingly small. Break one of these, my son. It is broken, venerable sir. What do you see there? Nothing at all, venerable sir." The father said, "That subtle essence, my dear, which you do not perceive there, from this very essence this great banyan arises. Believe me, my dear, now that which is the subtle essence, in it all that exists has itself. That is true, that is the self. Thou art that Svetaketu, the Chandogya Upanishad chapter 12. Nothingness, then, is not nothing but a something that appears to defy the normal categories of understanding, and therefore, perhaps the normal principles of judgment. Hence the tendency toward the use of allegories, parables, and dialogues. The self or transcendental ego is not in the world like the banyan tree, but rather lies at the boundary of the world. There is no difficulty in identifying the above form of the banyan tree, even if nothing can be seen. In the above, however, it seems that this truth is also connected to the truth of a self, which also cannot be seen. Thou art that, it is stated. This is a transcendental truth, and reminds us of the Wittgensteinian dictum, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must consign to silence. Proposition 7 Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. This, however, would not have been the view either of the Upanishads or Aristotle's metaphysics. The above mythological/religious text, however, appears to be attempting to reveal the truth in the Greek spirit of aletheia. This is not, however, being done in the way in which Aristotle seeks the truth of the many meanings of being. Aristotle is a rationalist and sees archi, founding principles, to be the most reliable component of logos, and for him it is clear that there are principles or forms connected to that realm of being called sush, which is that form of life that inhabits the physical realm of space, time and matter. For Aristotle, matter is essentially connected to that which forms it into the entities we experience, and it is these forms that function like organizing principles. Life is as much, for Aristotle, defined by its origins, as its end in death, and the origin mythology focuses upon insofar as life is concerned is that of Mother Earth. The mystery for mythology is simple. How can a living entity emerge from a non-living environment? The many different forms of life are, of course, fascinating, but none is more fascinating than the human form that is capable of significantly changing the environment lived in by building cities and civilizations, whilst inquiring into his own nature and the nature of everything around. The powers of human nature, then, are important areas of study, more for the philosopher than the priest or mythologist. Campbell claims that we no longer live in an age of mythology, religion, art, or philosophy, but rather appear to have succumbed to the more materialistically constituted forces of economics and politics. Campbell notes, for example, with considerable regret, that after Thomas Mann went to live in America, he became engaged with political issues and lost his creative flair. This was around the time when Wittgenstein was complaining about the sound of engines in the music of Brahms, and Renoir made his aesthetic complaint about modern architecture. We get too accustomed to these things, and to such a point that we don't realize how ugly they are. And if the day ever comes when we become entirely accustomed to them, it will be the end of a civilization which gave us the Parthenon and the Cathedral of Rouen. Then men will commit suicide from boredom, or will kill each other off just for the pleasure of it. Stokes, A. The Collected Writings of Adrian Stokes, Volume 3, The Invitation in Art, London, Thames and Hudson, 1978, p. 278. The 1900s, of course, began with the ready-made urinal of Duchamp's, and in the name of this modern art, we also experienced a number of paradoxical works in several mediums, from weightless sculptures to empty canvases to soundless musical performances. T.S. Eliot also contributed to the spirit of these times with his poem, The Waste Land, and Hannah Arendt noted that the political party system was already collapsing around the turn of the century. The conditions were being laid for the emergence of totalitarian regimes and the subsequent deaths of millions of people, amongst them those hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians that died from the dropping of 2 atomic bombs.